Welcome back to the Daily Poem here on the Close Reads Podcast Network. I'm David Kern, and today is March 3rd, 2020. The poem that I'm going to read today is a poem that I read early on in the life of this show, but it's a poem that I wanted to bring up again. It's one that I like to return to periodically, if for no other reason that it's a lot of fun to read. It's by Lewis Carroll, who of course was also known as Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. That was his real name. He lived from 1832 to 1898, and as you probably know, is most famous for the Alice in Wonderland stories, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, being the sequel. And the poem that I'm going to read today is one of his nonsense poems called Jabberwocky, and it's a poem that I find children and adults alike have a great time with. It goes like this. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borrow groves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jubjub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tumtum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy, O frabjous day, calloo callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borrow groves, and the mome raths outgrabe. This was a poem that was composed in 1855 and then published in 1871, although in a slightly different form than the original composition. In his anthology that I've mentioned many times in this show, The Classic 100 Poems, edited by William Harmon, he says that if you haven't already, it, quote, would be a good idea just to read through it before getting bogged down in the commentary and the annotation. And he talks about how people try to annotate every word, try to understand all the allusions he's making, and that Carroll's making, of course, in this nonsense poem. But I like that William Harmon says just read it, because I really think that what Carroll wants us to do is just enjoy it. He's obviously alluding to some classic forms. He's trying to tell a narrative in the midst of this nonsense poem. But it's also meant to be fun. It's meant to be enjoyable. It's meant to be kind of like a game. The way he's exploring language and playing with it and playing with the nature of sounds in poetry, which ultimately is one of the great things that poetry gives us, is the ability to experiment and play with the way sounds do different things when they bounce off of each other, and the way sounds can mean things because they sound a certain way. That's one of the fascinating things about language, and poetry is uniquely suited to help explore that idea. And another thing I like about this poem is the way that even if you don't know what the words mean, because of course most of them don't mean anything, even with that, there is a clear sense of tension and narrative and all those things that are in the poem. We don't have to know what the words mean to know what's going on. In fact, the more he tries to confuse us and kind of play with it, the more the sounds themselves create the meaning. For example, there's that line where it says, the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. The sounds of those languages, those are sort of Germanic sounding words, right? The sounds of them imply everything, even though the words themselves don't mean anything because they're not real words. A word like galumphing, he's playing with the tradition of language while also recognizing that the sounds themselves have meaning. And that's one of the great gifts that someone like Lewis Carroll offered us. Harmon wrote, quote, "Stand back from the details and see an action-adventure cartoon about a youngster who, after being warned by a parent or other older person, goes off and slays a monster. He comes back to a celebration, and the last stanza repeats the first, as though the same thing were going to happen all over again." Of course, if you do want to go into how Carroll formed some of these words he made up and is playing with, if you want to think about things like portmanteau, in which two elements of words are packed together, then, and Harmon mentions the word suitcase as an example of that, then by all means, jump online, Google around, have some fun with it the way Lewis Carroll did. But if you just want to enjoy the sound and just kind of hang out with it, then that's one of the great things about this poem, and poetry in general is that it's uniquely suited for that kind of experience. So with that in mind, then, here it is one more time, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borrow groves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the frumious Bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand. Long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tumtum tree and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, calloo callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borrow groves, and the mome raths outgrabe. This has been the Daily Poem. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with another poem for you.